Maybe we're gonna get a little vain and cocky about it, but we did fight against the whole coup and everything, and it failed. Obviously it was because of many things, but it failed, did it not? And if anybody has ever admired the generation that stood up on campuses everywhere and said, we do not support the war in Vietnam, those people are like basic heroes now that we look up to them because they were right when everybody was, wrong. So this is basically the chance. I'd say this is the chance to be anti-war, be pro-peace, and be the modern hippie, right?
Yadira Escobar, Cuban American. My wife called her a Cuban national treasure.
It's a lot of pressure to live up to that. Yes.
It's a challenge.
Yes, can't fall short of that. Oh boy. You said your name is Danny?
Danny.
Oh, Danny. That I'm really glad that Danny was mentioning so much of the sanctions, because one of the things that I can't stand is when people get used to something, even if it's atrocious. Let me bear that in mind the time, because I'm not the time. Dictatorship of time. But that one of the things that I can't stand is when people get numb to injustice. When it's like, well, what does it matter if there are millions of people dying in Yemen? It's like you want to just shake them up and just say, it doesn't matter. You've been hearing this for over half a century. The embargo is real. It's so real. It's still there. It's so real and perhaps even effective. I'd say it's had a lot of effect. That's why it's still in place. You can't tell me that, the embargo is nothing. Socialism doesn't work by itself. Then why are they still using those techniques? Why are they still in place? Why are they using it against Venezuela? Apparently the economy is just like, it's dropped like 50%. Why? Because it works. And I can't get enough of that that phrase that basically just sums it up. Which was described by, I'm sure all Cubans here know what I'm going to read. Lester D. Mallory, deputy, if y'all could see my notes, I just drew on it. So at least it's better than last time, which I just came with 9 papers and it was a mess and I couldn't read anything. But okay, the purpose of the embargo was described by Lester D. Mallory, deputy undersecretary of state for Inter-American Affairs on April 6, 1960. Not even my dad had been born by then, because that's what's horrific about the embargo. These sanctions are so terrible that you can have a child, small little kid in Cuba, and not his parent, but his grandfather was also born under the sanctions. So in a memorandum to the Undersecretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Lester says, most Cubans support Castro. They've known this forever. In fact, I would say that most Cubans still support Castro. In fact, not even the exiled Cubans in Miami can let go of Castro. You still hear on the AM radio, they're talking about, because Fidel did this, and even the host, they have to say, Fidel's dead. Can you just drop the guy already? Because the revolution was more than just one man. It's the ideas, and Fidel knew about it too. So he says, most Cubans support Castro. There's no effective political opposition. They've always known that the opposition is a sham. And of course, I don't mean natural people that have a problem with the system. My own family had problems. That's why I'm here. That's why we are here in Miami. A lot of us Cubans, not just for economic reasons. Some of us did have problems. We clash with that heavy bureaucracy and all the evils that camouflaged themselves and just made the switch. And those are the problems that Venezuela also has, where they're not revolutionary. Deep inside their homes, they're still dragging on the same problems from the Batista era. But he said that yes, the opposition was a sham, and the only foreseeable means to alienate international support is by creating disillusionment and discouragement based on lack of satisfaction and economical difficulties. We should immediately use any possible measure to cause hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. And the hunger, there is no real hunger in Cuba, but there is monotony. Okay, you're gonna just have rice, you're gonna have some beans, you're gonna have some whatever grew in your very fertile land. So there was this study done by the UN that basically they found out that it was like 37, what was the percentage? Again, I don't know why I write these notes if later I can't even read them all. Okay, so the UN, they did a study and they found out that under the age of 3, there was a small percentage of children in Cuba in 2009. The economy was good back then because back then they were still connected to Venezuela and everything was good. I mean, I went to Cuba in 2008. My uncle said, look at this, I got a tank full of rice. I don't need anything. You know, obviously the things have been reduced. I mean, that's one of the reasons. That's like my motivation right now to just speak out against these sanctions, even if half of the people watching the live stream will say, what sanctions? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the very real possibility of the special period returning to Cuba. And back in like 1992, 1993, I only lived 6 years in Cuba, but I remember it very well, how people that were so respectable degraded themselves. They just sunk to these incredible levels. People died. You know, at the end, it's not just because Bolton, you know, he says, international law, what is that? So according to Bolton, it's like the Pirates of the Caribbean thing. They're more like guidelines. We don't need to respect them. Well, it's so easy to dictate these horrible policies to bring about a regime change that will supposedly benefit American interests. I say there are many ways to respect, honor American interests, and that is definitely not the way. But we'll get to that. There are many reasons. But when you consider that in the 90s, where America had such a booming economy, credits were so easy to attain. The 90s were so good in America. The colors, because when, the switch from those two parallel worlds of Cuba's dire situation, because the Soviet Union had collapsed and Cuba had lost most of its markets, the subsidies, everything disappeared overnight. And in Camagüey, the province where I was born, people that were used to eating beef at least once a week suddenly had no source of protein. And people died, people went blind, and nobody cared. And it's an embarrassment that we later on, you'll see that there are millions of dollars of federal money, our taxes, used to support democracy because they hide a law. There are many reasons for punishing Cuba. The reasons they change every decade or so. Who knows what they'll be saying next year? But it was just such a contrast to have the world's biggest economy, the world's biggest war machinery, just the number one giant, sanction such a small island that will not be coerced, that will not be pushed into submission. They would rather suffer it the way they've been suffering for 60 years than to just bend down and lick some Yankee boot. It's not going to happen. That's why, not at all. That's why Cuba recently passed a law they call the late 1880, a law of reaffirmation of dignity and sovereignty meant to protect the economy, meaning that if anybody tries to give off information to the American government that will, again, worsen the economy, they know that that's a traitor to the Cuban nation. Why? Because that means that children will not have access to medicine, children will not have access to a whole bunch of vitamins that here we have, cornflakes, they add vitamin D. We've got a surplus of vitamins here. People don't even want to fry their eggs now in these iron skillets because no more iron. But children have deficiencies, in Cuba. Why? Because the embargo is real and these sanctions are meant to just crush people's spirit, and it doesn't work. My Cuban side knows this, and I'm just sometimes shocked when I read in English. I'm in America and I'm reading what some of these programs for subversion are planning to do in Cuba, and then like my Cuban just wakes up and says, "What the hell? No. I know my people. They're not going to tolerate this because it's degrading." When you see these right-wing Republicans, they talk about, freedom of markets. Well, how come I can't do business with Cuba? Will you just let me be a free American citizen and do business with whoever the heck I want? Why can't I travel to Cuba freely? If I didn't have my two grandmothers over there that tell me basically what's going on. And at the end of the day, when you analyze the reasons, supposedly, like the reasons that they have these crippling sanctions on Cuba, sanctions that were just tightened once Cuba lost the Soviet Union, because it's like what they did to North Korea. North Korea had a drought a couple years ago. sanctions. It's like, okay, so I'm dying, you just want to kick me in the rear, and so just to make things worse, right? I'm sorry, but according to what like these right-wing Republican people say, especially around the holiday times, which they, Merry Christmas, and they just give each other cards and all that. Well, you do know that's your brethren, right? They're like 90 miles, because in Latin, basically the origin of prójimos was like próximos. It's basically anybody that was close to you. So if you want to be this hyper nationalistic, cozy Christian with nice conservative values, don't you think you should be trying to make friends with your Cuban neighbors? They're like right there. There are kids there that are growing up knowing that you, who are so fat with prosperity, just want them to starve. Why? Oh, because you don't like the unique economic and political system that they have. A model which I am sick and tired of hearing, that is just an experiment. Guess what? All human endeavor is an experiment. This university, be it socialism or capitalism or a religious community, everything is an experiment, and I'm more than happy to welcome experiments because life is constantly changing. So why would you want to be stuck in the cave, as a Neanderthal? Oh no, I don't want to try no experiments. We need to experiment things. That's what's good about the Cuban Revolution, that is constantly changing. But those changes, those reforms, guess what? Embargo, they're all economic reforms, because supposedly the push, the coercion, the methods of asphyxiating the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban people, let's be honest, the Cuban people, these sanctions are meant to do a regime change and basically change the political system. Oh, one-party system, that's horrific. We need, you guys need two, like us, you guys need two parties, so that you can switch around the power between the two. But the Cuban model, since the sanctions cripple the economy, what are they doing? They're doing economic reforms. That's why the other day they recently added to their list of allowable things. Now people can have cyber cafes, these internet cafes. They can have internet, sure. Even though most of the internet in the Cuban blogosphere, all of that is just saturated with fake entities. They're just they're journalists, but it's like Radio Marti people. They're not journalists. These people are paid to basically just find whatever they find on the internet and justify. If you listen to what these Cuban journalists on the outside of Cuba are saying, the depths to which they will sink, they talk about embarrassing things that I would not even mention here because it's indecent. How they take pictures of little girls in the Malecon, they say prostitutes. Really? That does not sound like a political speech. You're not trying to change the economic model. What you're trying to do is degrade the national spirit. You want Cubans to be embarrassed that they can't afford toilet paper. It's like what they did to Venezuela. Toilet paper. Do you really think humans can just value as the ultimate prize of possession just toilet paper? Like, really? And when you hear these people, these so-called journalists, talk about Cuba, you see that all that they do is just trying to degrade the national spirit, just degrade them completely, so that then the Cubans, they would say, well, I'm going to gladly give up this garbage of a country. But it's not true, because Cuba is like one of the last possible chances that people have of experimenting. One of the last places where you don't have these multinationals dictating policy, but because they're basically like the new gods of our time. They can just run through these national boundaries and do anything that they want. But essentially, what's really grotesque about how everything has been tightening, how everything has just, the situation with Cuba is worsening, is how I feel that we're losing what we acquired after World War II. Because after World War II, in 1941, the Atlantic Charter set out 8 goals. And I want to read just 4 of them because it's incredible how it's like we're dumb and we just can't, we don't learn from our mistakes, and then we try to just repeat the same mistakes. Because one of the 4 things of just absolute stupidity that we have lost is, 1, they knew in 1941 that all people had the right to self-determination. It's like common sense. It's simple. It's liberty. You want to preach liberty? How about letting the Cubans decide what kind of government they want? Then later on we could talk about whether it's right or wrong, because that's also something that I can't stand, is how whenever you want to talk about Cuba, you have to earn the right to defend something that you like. You have to legitimize your voice, and you have to do some criticism. You have to criticize. You have to say, oh, well, but the regime doesn't allow this. Now can I say that kids kind of have free education? You know, you have to like earn the right to speak, and that's just horrific. But anyways, the Atlantic Charter said all people have the right to self-determination, global economic cooperation, and advancement on social welfare, because yes, not everybody is a 20-year-old super healthy buff Trump supporter who can, you know, just go to work and everything's all right. You have disabled people, you have sick people, you have elderly people. There are just so many parts of society that will not fit that kind of ubermensch soldier thing that will just push the economy forward, that of course you need to have some sort of safety net to watch out for people, because we're not going to be the Greeks, we're not going to have disabled children, put them out in the mountains so the wolves take care of that, because that just leads again to fascism. And they also knew that all the participants of the Atlantic Charter would try to create a world that was free of want and free of fear, but also, especially this one, I'm absolutely amazed, freedom of the seas. So that means that Rick Scott should not be proposing a naval blockade against Cuba. It's like, Rick Scott, did you not know that in 1941, we kind of already figured out that you don't do this in the high waters? You need to have freedom of movement. You need to have cooperation. And also, the embargo cannot be punishing other countries. China cannot be punished because the current administration decided that now we're going to punish Cuba because of some supposed stronghold that they have in Venezuela, which I have to add that it is absolutely ridiculous when you hear the story that Iran, Russia, and Cuba, 3 separate countries, 3 different nations, 3 different languages, and they say that these 3 different nations are controlling Venezuela. You know, as if Venezuela was. It's like, think about it. Can Russia and Cuba work at the same time to control a country? It doesn't, like in colonial times, that has never happened. Never have you had superpowers deal with a lesser country like that. And then, of course, let's remember, where's Venezuela in all of this, right? They just want any nation to step all over them, right? But again, I don't know how much time I have left, but to sum it up, basically, yes, I think that the embargo, not only is it immoral and just harms us, but if you look at the sanctions imposed against Cuba from a very selfish, pragmatic point of view, it also harms us. It harms our local economy, because every year we lose, I will find it. Okay, first, the United States loses around $1,000 million to $3,000 million a year. So it's costing us. We're losing money. You know how many farmers just want to just do business with Cuba? But wasn't that like what the essence of a free market is all about? Shouldn't people have the right to be adventurous and go do business with whoever they want? Oh no, you can't do that. It's forbidden. Why? Because they preach one thing, but then they do another. And of course, not to mention that the embargo itself has cost Cuba thousands of millions of dollars, but again, it doesn't matter. I mean, the Guantanamo Bay, the base, the military base, for instance, we're not paying the Cubans for that. So what are they doing there, right? I mean, we could discuss whether or not they belong there or not, but they're not paying. And the last time I checked, in America, if you don't pay for a house, you're getting foreclosured. All right? So you have to pay for that place. You can't just stay there and say, well, I can do this because it's a dictatorship and all that. But when they're constantly living in denial, when our administrations live in denial, who does that harm? Not just the Cubans, it also harms us. Because if the government in the 60s had not been wasting its time in denial, thinking that with the Bay of Pigs, that they were going to just get rid of that pesky problem that they had in Cuba, because they were so sure that the Soviet Union would last forever, and that with Cuba, let's just invade them, we'll get rid of that little pimple, that problem, we'll get rid of that real quick. And had they not been wasting time with that, they would have sat down and negotiated all the nationalizations that took place, just like other countries did. Other more respectable and responsible countries actually tried to negotiate, and the people received, all these companies received their rightful compensation. But except the United States, and I think there was one particular British corporation that also did not receive that. But had they sat down and negotiated, had they actually had some dialogue with the revolutionary people that in that time had full support of the people, all this would have been paid off by the 80s, and we wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't have another excuse to sanction the Cubans, because of the properties, but you didn't really care about the properties back then. Okay, human rights, you don't really care about the violation of human rights, because the programs that you do, most of the money just stays here in Miami with corrupt politicians, all right? Most of the money does not even go to Cuba. It just crumbs, that's what reaches Cuba. But again, so I don't take up any more of your time because Max is going to talk to you about Venezuela now. Again, I didn't really read much, but you all basically got to have a basic idea of what I'm trying to defend here, which is, of course, the Cuban people, who are the only ones that at the end of the day are suffering these sanctions. So, thank you so much.
Before we go into the burning questions, wasn't my wife right?
Yeah.
The other thing is what you see her saying here. She's not just saying it to us here. She often goes to Cuban TV here, and she says the same things in the Cuban TV. And you know what? That's called guts. That's having guts. So Yadira is